There were 30 days left until the first wave of disasters, and anyone who failed to build a shelter by then would be dead. The system's voice echoed in the minds of each of the 12,000 who had been transported, announcing that the continent of Seret was purifying itself through cycles of disasters and would show no mercy to the weak. Aaron stood in the crowd on the gray distribution plane, realizing that the question of his very survival was being decided right now. People around him were screaming and crying. Some demanded to be sent back home. Others were praying. The system did not respond to the cries. It displayed a translucent panel in front of each person and offered them the chance to select one talent from among 1,000 possibilities. Aaron touched the panel and felt a chill down the back of his neck. The word forecast lit up on the panel. The description was brief. The bearer can see the weather and natural events 30 days in advance within a 50-kilometer radius. Accuracy, 99%. Aaron closed his eyes and the world changed. He saw a bird's-eye view of the area. Colored layers crept across the map. He focused on the coming week, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. On the 9th day, a 40-kilometer-wide storm front descended from the northern mountains. The water level in the river valley rose by 11 meters in 6 hours. The entire beautiful green lowland to the east was submerged. On the 14th day, a dry thunderstorm set the western forests ablaze, and the fire spread in a 20-kilometer-wide swath. On the 22nd day, a migration of gray lizards began from the scorched lands, and their stream passed through the central hills. On the 30th day, a storm arrived with hailstones the size of a fist. Aaron opened his eyes and looked at the people around him with a different perspective. All these people were looking at the green valley by the river and saw future fields and clear water there. Aaron saw a mass grave there. Next to him, a broad-shouldered man named Brant was boasting that he'd drawn the stone skin talent and that he'd claimed the best plot right by the water. He asked Aaron about his talent. Aaron replied that he'd drawn the weather forecast. Brant laughed so hard that the neighbors turned to look. He said the system should pay extra for such a worthless talent, and that Aaron could keep predicting rain while real men were out killing monsters. Aaron nodded silently. Arguing was pointless and not worth the trouble. For each person who had been transported, the system issued a starting balance of 1,000 points and the right to claim a plot of land measuring 1 square kilometer. The distribution was overseen by a man named Holt, whom the system had appointed as the administrator for the accounting talent. Holt stood on a rock and called out the plot numbers. The lowland plots by the river were snapped up in a scramble. People paid each other in points for the right to trade, and the price of plots near the water reached as high as 300 points above the base price. The plots to the west, near the forest, were also going fast. There was timber, berries, and shade there. Aaron waited. He looked at his internal map and compared it to the terrain. He needed elevation number 47, a dry, rocky hill 60 meters high with a flat summit and a single gentle trail from the south. No water, no forest, no grass. Gray rock and thorny shrubs. On the forecast map, this hill had remained untouched by all 3 disasters of the month. The downpour had bypassed it based on elevation calculations. Fire had no fuel there. The lizard migration skirted the hill through the lowlands because lizards didn't like to climb. When Holt called out number 47, the crowd fell silent. No one raised a hand. Holt was already about to move the number to the bottom of the list when Aaron stepped forward and said he'd take that plot. For a second, it went quiet. Then Brant was the first to burst out laughing, and the rest followed suit. Holt lowered the list and looked at Aaron as if he were crazy. He asked again if Aaron understood that there wasn't a drop of water on plot 47, that there was no soil there, and that any other plot would be better. Aaron replied that he understood, and that his decision was final. Holt shrugged and wrote down his name. He added under his breath that in a month he'd come by to look at his dried-up corpse out of sheer curiosity. People around him were still laughing as Aaron made his way to the system's trading terminals. He had 1,000 points and knew exactly what to spend them on. Everyone around him was buying food and weapons. Food was expensive because people were snapping it up in a panic. Aaron bought something else: 2 pieces of scrap steel, 3 pickaxes, 4 shovels, 200 meters of rope, 10 rolls of heavy fabric, 50 empty barrels at a ridiculous price because nobody needed them, a field forge for 300 points that nobody had taken because, near the forest areas, metal seemed like a luxury. With the remainder, he bought a sack of salt and 20 cans of lard. He bought exactly 6 days' worth of food. Brant saw his purchases and tapped his temple with a finger. He said that a fool with a knack for rain buys barrels instead of food, and that it was the best joke of the day. Aaron loaded everything onto the cart provided by the system and dragged it up to his hill. The climb took 3 hours. At the top, he stopped and surveyed his domain. A flat summit the size of 2 soccer fields, cracks in the rock, an old riverbed where water had once flowed. He crouched down at the southern edge and looked down into the valley. Life was already bustling there. Hundreds of people were pitching tents right by the river. The camp of a man named Delmar was the farthest away and the most lavish of all. Aaron had heard of him back at the assignment ceremony. Delmar possessed the rare talent of a master of oaths and had already gathered more than 400 people under his command. His people had taken the very heart of the valley and were already marking out the streets of the future city. Delmar stood on a hill in the middle of the camp, speaking, and the crowd responded with a unified murmur. Aaron watched this and felt a chill. In 9 days, 11 meters of water would flow through this very spot. He could go down and warn them. He'd considered this option back at the assignment ceremony. No one would believe him. A man with a talent for scavenging and a plot on bare rock would be shouting about a flood under a clear sky. At best, they'd laugh at him. At worst, Delmar would decide that the outsider was spreading panic and force him to shut up. And if, by some miracle, they did believe him, Delmar's 400 men would be the first to reach his hill, and the hill would cease to be his. Aaron gripped the shovel handle and turned away from the valley. He was neither a god nor a savior. He was a survivor. He set to work. First, he drove in stakes and marked out the summit, a living pit in the center, a storage area by the northern wall, a site for water tanks by the old riverbed. He worked until dark and widened a natural crevice with a crowbar until it was large enough to serve as a shelter. At night, he lay in the crevice, wrapped in cloth, listening to the singing by the campfires down in the valley. He opened the forecast map and checked each day once more. The 9th day remained unchanged. The rain front had even widened. The forecast's accuracy had reached its limit. Aaron stared at the red band of the coming flood and wasn't thinking about the water. He was thinking about what would happen on the 10th day. Thousands of people would lose everything and flee in search of dry ground. And the only dry spot within 20 kilometers would be his hill, his empty hill, where he was alone and had only 6 days' worth of food. He realized that the real problem wasn't surviving the flood. The real problem would come to him on its own immediately after the flood, and it would have thousands of hungry eyes. He had 8 days left. Aaron turned off the map and forced himself to sleep. Tomorrow, he would have to work harder than he ever had in his life. The morning of the 8th day before the flood began with pain in his palms, and Aaron realized that his calluses had burst while he slept. He wrapped his hands in cloth and continued working. Those 8 days condensed into 4 scenes for him. The first scene was a rock. He chiseled away at the old channel with a crowbar, deepening it into the cistern, and by the 4th day, he had a reservoir capable of holding 20 metric tons of water, lined with 3 layers of thick cloth. Next to it, he set out all 50 barrels and connected them with troughs made from dry shrub trunks split lengthwise. The second scene was a wall. He didn't build a wall around the entire perimeter because that would have taken months. He blocked off the only southern path with dry stone masonry 2 human heights high and left a passageway wide enough for a single cart. The third scene was food. On the 6th day, The food ran out, and Aaron went down to the foot of the hill, set snares for rock hares, and dug up bitter onion roots. By the evening of the 8th day, he had 11 carcasses preserved in fat and salt. The 4th scene was observation. Every evening, he would sit on the southern edge and compare the map with the sky. Down below, the valley went about its business, oblivious to him. The people of Delmar had already erected a palisade and built a bridge across the river. Brant and his 10 men had taken up a plot right by the riverbank and were boasting about their catch. Holt had organized a market in the central clearing. On the 8th evening, the sky was clear and large bonfires blazed in the camps. Aaron looked north. There, above the mountains, was a thin gray band that no one down below considered significant. His map glowed red. The front was advancing exactly as calculated. Aaron checked the gutters and went to sleep in a dry alcove under a rocky overhang. The downpour began at 4 in the morning, and it wasn't rain, it was the sky coming crashing down. The water pounded against the rocks so hard that the rumble resonated in his chest. Aaron stepped out under the overhang and watched as the streams from his gutters rushed into the cistern and barrels. By dawn, everything was full. 26 metric tons of fresh water. He shut off the gutters and walked to the southern edge, and what he saw below stayed with him for the rest of his life. The river was gone. In its place was a moving, brown expanse of water. It carried tents, logs, livestock, and people. Delmar's palisade buckled under the pressure like grass. The bridge had vanished. Screams could be heard even through the downpour. People were floundering and clinging to debris as the water dragged them south. Those who had managed to wake up earlier fled toward the hills, but the low hills were turning into islands and melting away as the water rose. 11 meters in 6 hours. The forecast hadn't been off by even an inch. Aaron stood in the downpour and forced himself to watch. He had chosen this. He had chosen silence, and now he was seeing the price of that choice. By noon, the rain had let up, and the first survivors began making their way toward his hill. They scrambled up the southern trail, wet and gray, and came up against the wall and the single passageway where Aaron stood with a pickaxe in his hands. Brant was the first to reach him. His stone skin had saved him from the debris, but it hadn't saved his 10. He looked at the wall, then at the barrels of water, then at Aaron, and his face moved as if his muscles had forgotten how to function. He asked how Aaron had known. He said this without mockery and without any force in his voice. He repeated that Aaron had bought the barrels and shovels and secured the dry stone, and that this couldn't be a coincidence. Aaron replied that his talent wasn't about predicting rain. His talent was to see a month ahead, and he had seen that water as far back as the day of the rationing. Brant was silent for a long time. Then he asked why Aaron hadn't said anything. Aaron answered his question with a question of his own, asking if Brant would have believed him that day. Brant lowered his eyes and didn't answer. Instead of answering, he asked what Aaron wanted in exchange for a place on the hill. Aaron had been preparing for this question for all 8 days. He said that the hill accepts anyone who agrees to 3 rules. Work as assigned without argument. Weapons are turned into the armory, and Aaron's word on matters of disaster is obeyed instantly and without discussion. Anyone who disagrees goes down the hill, and Aaron will give them water for the journey. Brant was the first to agree, and his stone-hard hands hauled stone for the second wall until evening. By sunset, there were 63 people on the hill. By the end of the second day, there were 208. Aaron slept for 4 hours and spent the rest of the time assigning people to their tasks. The stonemasons worked on the walls. Women with a talent for herbs were assigned to sort roots. Hunters went down to the lowlands to hunt hares. 2 men with a talent for purifying water were sent to the cistern. Holt came too. His market had been washed away along with all his records, and he had climbed the trail with just 1 bag. He stopped in front of Aaron and said he'd come to look at his corpse, but instead saw the only living place in the valley. He said he'd been wrong, and that he'd never made such a mistake in his records. Aaron put him in charge of counting the people and supplies, and Holt threw himself into the work as if it were his salvation. The tally revealed a harsh reality. At the very lowest starvation ration, there was enough food left for 4 days. There was water, there was shelter, there was no food. 208 mouths were devouring hares faster than the snares could catch them. At night, Aaron pored over Holt's records and opened the forecast map. There was a way out, and it was a terrifying one. In 4 days, the Western Fire would begin. The fire was spreading through the forests, where the forest settlers were now perched on the surviving high ground, and where nature's storehouses, untouched by the flood, still stood. Everyone looked to the forest as their salvation and was preparing to go there for food. Aaron could see that in 4 days, the forest would become a furnace. But between today and the fire lay a 3-day window. 3 days during which they could enter the doomed forest and carry out whatever their hands could bear. Game that would burn anyway. Nuts that would burn anyway. Resin and honey and deadwood for firewood. They needed 40 men, all the carts, and a lot of nerve. And they also had to leave the forest no later than noon on the 14th day, because after noon, no one would be able to get out of there. Aaron looked at the map and realized one more thing. Delmar had taken refuge in the woods. The Lord of Oaths had survived and led some of his people to the western hills. And his oath-bound followers were already building a new camp among the trees, right in the path of the fire. And if Aaron led his men into the forest for supplies, Delmar's men would see strangers taking food and hurrying to leave. And they would ask questions. Aaron put out the map. He decided he would go. Hunger was a surer killer than any questions. He woke Brant and Holt and told them that 40 men with carts would set out west at dawn, and that they had 3 days. Holt asked what would happen in 3 days. Aaron replied that in 3 days, the West would cease to exist. 40 people and 11 carts entered the canopy of the western forest at dawn on the 11th day, and they had 72 hours before that forest turned to ash. Aaron divided the men into groups of 3, and assigned each group a section and a quota. No picking and choosing, no lingering to admire the scenery. Take everything that burns and everything that's edible. The work boiled down to a few scenes. Brant's hunters were taking down the game, which had proliferated after the flood, and had strayed into the woods from the flooded lands, and the carcasses were being hauled up the hill, one after another. The gatherers were stripping strips of bark from hazel bushes, and scooping honey from hollows right out of the hives, bees and all. Lumberjacks were felling dead wood and loading logs, which were worth more than meat in the city. Wagons shuttled back and forth between the forest and the hill like a shuttle, and Holt up on the hill could barely keep up with his record-keeping. By the evening of the first day, the hill's storehouse was no longer empty. By the evening of the second day, Holt reported that they had enough food to last 26 days. On the third day, they were spotted. A trio of foragers stumbled upon Delmar's patrol, and the sentries led them to their camp. Shortly afterward, Delmar himself emerged onto the clearing with about 50 men. Aaron came to the negotiations in person. Delmar turned out to be a tall man with a calm voice and the eyes of a merchant. He said he was glad to see organized people at a time like this. He said he'd heard about the hill that the water hadn't touched, and about the man who'd been buying up barrels before the rain. He asked why the people of the hill were hauling everything out of the forest at such a pace, as if death were chasing them. Aaron replied calmly, saying that his gift allowed him to predict the weather, and that by noon tomorrow a dry thunderstorm would come from the southwest and set the forest ablaze, and that the fire would sweep across this very clearing. He said that Delmar should lead his people east toward the water before noon. There was silence for a few seconds. Then Delmar's advisor, a thin man named Cassius, laughed and said that the stranger had made up a fairy tale to drive his competitors out of the forest and take everything for himself. For the third day in a row, the sky was clear as glass. Delmar didn't laugh. He looked at Aaron for a long moment and then said that he was grateful for the warning and that his men would stay where they were. Aaron nodded and left. He had done what he hadn't done before the flood, and his conscience was now clear, though his calculations remained just that, calculations. By midnight, his men had hauled away the last of the carts. By 10 o'clock in the morning of the 14th day, the last team of 3 horses climbed the hill. At noon, a purple cloud without rain rose in the southwest, and lightning struck the dry treetops from it. The forest caught fire in 6 places at once. By evening, the western horizon was a wall of fire 20 kilometers wide, and smoke obscured the sun. The people of the hill stood by the wall and watched in silence. They had been traveling through these places for 3 days. That night, the scorched people set out again along the southern trail. Delmar led his men to safety at the last moment and lost the camp and a third of their supplies. But he did not lose any men because, after Arena's departure, he did, after all, give the order to retreat toward the water. He himself did not come to the hill. Cassius arrived. The advisor stood in the passageway of the wall with his face wrapped in a wet rag, staring at the stacks of logs and smoked meat, and the eyes peering out from beneath the rag were those of a man whose worldview was crumbling. He said he had laughed at the fairy tale, but the fairy tale had burned the forest day after day, hour after hour. He said that Delmar had sent him with a proposal, an alliance between the 2 settlements, an exchange, and one request that sounded like a demand. Delmar asked that Aaron send him a 7-day forecast once a week. In return, Delmar offered protection. Aaron asked, "Protection from whom?" Cassius paused and replied that in the New World, there's always someone to protect against. Aaron understood everything he needed to know. He replied that he was willing to make a deal and was willing to warn his neighbors about deadly threats for free, because dead neighbors were worse than living ones. But a weekly forecast on a set schedule would turn him into a servant with a useful head, and servants' heads last only until a replacement is found. That wouldn't happen. Cassius said that Delmar would be upset. Aaron replied that he could handle his neighbor's disappointment more easily than a collar. After Cassius left, Holt remarked that Aaron had made an enemy. Aaron replied that he'd made an enemy the moment his hill remained dry, while Delmar's city was washed away. Everything else was just a matter of time. Over the next few days, the hill bustled with trade and construction. Word of the dry hill with food and water spread throughout the surviving lands, and people in groups began streaming toward the wall. Aaron didn't accept everyone. Holt kept lists of skills, and the hill took in builders, herbalists, and blacksmiths. The population exceeded 400. The first houses were built from logs. The blacksmith's forge began to clang. Brant assembled a guard from among the hunters and, setting an example, was the first to turn in his own axe to the storeroom. As for Aaron, every night he sat poring over the map, watching for the 22nd day. The migration of the gray lizards had changed. On the day of the distribution, the stream had flowed through the central hills along the edge and curved around his mountain through the lowlands. Now everything had shifted. The flood had washed away the southern reeds where the lizards fed. The fire had consumed the western forests where they hid. On the map of the future, thousands of gray dots were converging from the scorched and flooded lands into a single river, and this river was flowing toward the last place that smelled of food and life, toward his hill. The forecast predicted a stream a kilometer wide, no fewer than 3,000 individuals. An adult gray lizard weighed as much as 2 bulls and walked right through the palisade without even noticing it. Aaron sat poring over the map until dawn, doing the math. He had 8 days and 400 men, of whom barely 100 knew how to fight. The wall blocked the trail, but the lizards didn't need a trail. They would simply overwhelm the gentle western slope with sheer numbers. In the morning, he gathered Brant, Holt, and the elders and told them exactly as it was. He looked at their faces and saw fear circling in their eyes. Then Brant asked what to do, and Aaron drew out a plan with charcoal on a rock and said that they wouldn't wait for the lizards on the hill. They would meet them sooner, and they would need all the wood they'd hauled out, all the resin, and all the fat. And they would also need the rain that would come on the 22nd day, exactly 4 hours after the headwaters of the stream. Holt asked where such precision came from. Aaron replied that precision was the only thing they had. 8 days before the arrival of 3,000 lizards, Aaron led the men down into the valley and began building a trap the size of the valley itself, and he had absolutely no room for error. The plan relied on the terrain. West of the hill lay an old ravine 2 kilometers long, along which the stream would flow on its own, because the lizards always chose low-lying areas. Aaron decided not to stop the stream. Nothing could stop 3,000 lizards. He decided to guide it. The preparations boiled down to 4 stages. The first stage involved fences. People dug in logs, not as a wall, but in sparse, diagonal lines along the edges of the ravine. Such lines wouldn't stop a lizard, but a lizard is lazy and goes where it's clear, and the lines gently narrowed the stream's channel and led it away from the foot of the hill into the gorge's throat. The second scene involved resin. Along the bottom of the gorge's throat, for a stretch of 300 meters, they laid out dry, fallen branches drenched in resin and fat and sprinkled with soil on top to protect against accidental sparks. The third scene consisted of pits. At the mouth of the ravine, where the narrowing squeezed the stream into a dense mass, rows of pits were dug with stakes aimed at the leaders, because a herd without leaders becomes a herd without direction. The fourth scene was Orvin's face. Orvin had come up the hill with the last wave of refugees. In his past life, he had commanded men, and here he drew upon his talent as a veteran who could read a battle like a book. He surveyed the fortifications with a stony expression, and on the third day told Aaron straight out that the plan looked good on paper, but that a living wave of 3,000 heads would sweep away the slanted fences, and that burning the herd in the open was madness, because the prairie fire would then consume them as well. He said he'd seen many overconfident commanders, and they were all now fertilizing the earth. Aaron listened and replied that 4 hours after the head of the herd passed, a downpour would come and cover the steppe, extinguishing everything that needed to be extinguished. Orvin asked what would happen if the rain was late. Aaron replied that rain isn't late. Rain isn't an ally or a mercenary. It's physics. Orvin shook his head and stuck to his opinion, but he continued working because no one had any other plan. On the 22nd day, the earth began to rumble at dawn. At first, the rumble sounded like a distant landslide. Then dust rose over the west. Aaron stood on a log watchtower and watched as the head of the herd emerged from the dust. Their gray backs stretched out in a solid wall. The tail end of the column disappeared over the horizon. The men in their positions froze. Brant gripped his pike so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The herd reached the first slanted lines, and Aaron held his breath. The lead of the herd bumped into the logs, grumbled, and turned along the line like water flowing around a rock. Line by line, the channel narrowed, and the gray river obediently flowed into the gorge's throat. Orvin, on the neighboring watchtower, watched this in silence. When the head of the stream had traveled 300 meters along the tar-coated bottom, Aaron raised the red flag. Brant's archers loosed flaming arrows into the tar-sealed windows that had been opened in advance. The bottom of the ravine burst into flames along its entire length all at once. What followed was hell. The fire beneath their bellies caused the herd to turn in on itself. The animals in the rear pressed against those in front. Those in front scrambled up the walls of the ravine and slid back down. The leaders charged forward through the fire and fell into pits lined with stakes. The herd seethed within its stone bag, unable to move forward or turn back because another 2,000 animals, blind to the fire, were pressing in from behind by another 2,000 heads that could not see the fire. Aaron watched and kept track of time. Smoke rose in a column, and the fire was already creeping out of the ravine into the dry steppe. And Orvin shouted from the watchtower that the steppe was catching fire, and that in an hour the flames would be carried by the wind eastward toward their own hill. Aaron looked up toward the southwest. There, on the horizon, stood a dark band. He shouted a single word in reply: 1 hour. That hour was the longest of his life. The steppe fire spread in tongues, and the men at their posts looked back at Aaron, their eyes wavering. Then the first raindrops fell on their faces. The downpour came in a wall, exactly as the map had predicted, and in 20 minutes it drowned the steppe fire, extinguished the smoldering ravine, and turned the day of slaughter into a wet twilight. The surviving third of the herd turned and headed south, bypassing the area. The men stood in the rain amid the steam and smoke, silent. And then someone shouted, and 400 throats took up the cry. Orvin climbed up to the watchtower to join Aaron. The veteran was soaked to the skin and looked at Aaron as if seeing him for the first time. He said that in 30 years he'd never seen a commander call for rain by lunchtime. He said he'd been wrong twice, about the fences and about the fire, and that he didn't want to be wrong a third time, so he was asking permission to serve under Aaron's command for good. Aaron held out his hand to him. For the next 3 days, the hill tribe butchered the spoils, 1,500 carcasses. They smoked and salted the meat around the clock, and Holt announced that they now had enough food to last half a year, while the hides and bones would supply the forge and workshops for a year. The hide of a gray lizard held the arrow. From the plates of the dorsal crest, Orvin began assembling the first suits of armor for the guards. Word of the battle spread faster than smoke. People were now arriving not by the dozens, but by the hundreds, and by the end of the month, the population had surpassed 1,000. On the 30th day, with its storm and hail, the hill people weathered the storm under stone overhangs and shelters made of hides, almost bored. And this calm amid the roar spoke to the newcomers more than any stories could. And then the system spoke again. The voice rang in the head of everyone on the continent and announced that the first cycle of purification was complete, that the survivors had performed better than expected, and that the second cycle would therefore be commensurate with that success. In 60 days, the long night would come from the north. 20 days of darkness, temperatures as low as -40, and the creatures of the depths that hunt in the dark. The voice faded, and silence hung over the hill. Aaron opened the map and for the first time saw something he hadn't seen before. The northern edge of the map, at the limit of its range, was blurred. The forecast showed the boundary of the cold as a jagged white stripe, and the stripe seemed to breathe, offering no precise figures. For the first time, his talent had encountered something at the very limit of its power. And that same evening, Brant brought in a stranger they'd intercepted on the southern trail. They found a map of the hill drawn in charcoal on the stranger, showing walls, warehouses, and guard posts. The stranger remained silent, but Holt recognized him. It was one of Cassius's men. Aaron looked at the map of his own fortress, drawn by a stranger's hand, and realized a simple truth. Delmar had heard about the long night, just like everyone else, and he decided that he would weather it not near the hill, but on the hill itself. And after merging with the southern communities, Delmar now had about 2,000 men, Aaron let the scout go alive and ordered him to tell Delmar that the hill had seen his plans before they were even drawn, and that this was the first move in a war that could no longer be called off. Holt called it a mistake and said the captive was a trump card. Aaron replied that the captive was an invitation to negotiate on his terms, and that Delmar would come himself because the Lord of Oaths always prefers to speak first. The calculation turned out to be half correct. Delmar arrived 9 days later, but he did not come to speak. He brought an army. Orvan's sentries reported the column a day in advance, and at dawn, the plain south of the hill was swarming with people. From the watchtower, Holt counted about 800 fighters and supply wagons. Delmar left the rest behind to hold their lands and led a strike force bound by oaths. A white flag was raised above the camp, and 3 people approached the wall: Delmar, Cassius, and a standard-bearer named Scylla, her face cold and impassive. The conversation took place through a passage in the wall. Delmar spoke calmly and almost friendly. He said that the long night would kill those who were scattered, and that only those who were united would survive. He proposed an alliance to Arena, shared walls, shared storerooms, and a shared council where Arena would hold the honorary position of advisor on the elements. Arn asked who would be the head of the council. Delmar smiled and replied that the head would be determined naturally. Arn said he could see the proposal to surrender the hill was just a pretty package. He replied that the hill was willing to negotiate and was ready to take in Delmar's women and children as guests for the winter, but that authority over the hill was not up for discussion. Cassius began to speak of ingratitude, and Delmar stopped him with a gesture. He gave Arn a long look and said he was sorry. Then he said something that made Brant, standing nearby's jaw drop. He said he knew about the blurred northern part of Arena's map. There was more than one spy, and the second one had overheard conversations on the hill. Delmar said that Arena's talent waned in extreme cold, and that an elemental advisor with a fading gift was still an asset, whereas a stubborn little king on a rock was simply an obstacle. He gave Arena 3 days to think it over and went down to his troops. That night, Arena sat alone poring over the map. There was a bitter truth in Delmar's words. The white band in the north really wasn't yielding any numbers, but Delmar didn't know any different. Everything closer to the white band, the map still showed 99 with its usual accuracy. And right now, the map showed 14 days from this night, something that made Arena recalculate everything 3 times over. 2 weeks of autumn downpours had already saturated the ground. The southern plain where Delmar's camp stood lay in an old floodplain on a layer of clay. And on the 14th day, the season's last warm storm would arrive from the southwest and dump a month's worth of rain in a single night. The map traced reddish tongues across the plain. The slope above the floodplain would give way. A half-kilometer-wide mudslide would descend onto the floodplain, and in its wake, the old riverbed would reclaim its course, and a flood wave would surge through it. The camp for 800 people stood right in the reddish zone. Aren closed the map and didn't sleep until morning. He had already remained silent once in the face of the flood, and he had carried that burden with him ever since. In the morning, he picked up the white scrap of paper himself. Delmar stepped up to the wall with the smirk of a man accepting a surrender. In front of all his commanders, Aren said that in 13 days, at night, a landslide and a flood would sweep down onto the floodplain, that the camp must be moved to the eastern heights, and that this was not a bargaining chip, but a warning he was issuing for free, just as he had done before the fire. Scylla was the first to laugh. She said the trick was an old one, and that last time, the prophet had gotten lucky with the thunderstorm. But now, he was trying to drive the army out of a comfortable position with a fairy tale about mud. Cassius remained silent, staring at the ground. Cassius remembered the forest. Delmar spread his arms and replied that he appreciated the effort, but that the army would remain where it was and, in 3 days, would begin building siege ladders. Aaron nodded and went behind the wall. 13 days of the siege were condensed into a few scenes. Delmar's men lit bonfires in a ring, cut off the trails, and shouted at night beneath the wall about the famine that would come to the hill. The hill remained silent and worked. Orvin kept the guards patrolling the walls. Holt was tallying supplies for 20 days of darkness. Every evening, Aaron would go out to the southern edge and look down at the camp below, and every evening, Sila on the other side would raise a torch in a mocking salute to the prophet. On the 12th day, Cassius came to the wall alone at night and asked Aaron to tell him to his face whether the landslide was true. Aaron said one word, "True." Cassius disappeared into the darkness. It later became known that he had spent the night trying to persuade Delmar to move at least the supply wagons and the infirmaries, and that Delmar, tired of him, had sent him out of sight to a distant sentry post. On the 14th night, a storm came. It arrived right on schedule. The downpour fell on the plain like a wall, and by midnight, the slope above the floodplain gave way and began to slide. The people on the hill stood on the ramparts in the rain and listened as the rumble grew below. Then the rumble became a roar, and the roar drowned out the screams. The landslide swept through the western half of the camp, and then the old riverbed took over, and the water carried the devastation all the way to the eastern half. By dawn, the rain had subsided, and where Delmar's troops had been stood a brown plain in ruins. Aaron wouldn't let anyone look. He opened the gates and led 300 men down with ropes and stretchers. The order was simple: pull everyone out. None of their own were down by the hill. Only the enemy remained below. They were pulled out of the mud all day long. Just over 500 were found alive. Delmar was found by evening under a collapsed command tent, his legs broken. They carried him up the hill on a stretcher. He remained silent the whole way, staring at the gray sky. The Lord of Oath's talent could bind only those who were not stronger, and in the mud beneath the canopy, his power had run out. Silu was pulled alive from the riverbed. She sat motionless outside the infirmary for a day and then came to Aaron. Her cold face was no longer cold. She said she had laughed at the prophet twice. The first time was when he spoke of the mud, and the second time was in her heart when he opened the gates to save those who had come to kill him. She said that both times she had been wrong about him, and that such mistakes change people. She asked that the survivors be accepted under the rules of the hill, and was the first to accept all 3 rules aloud. Following her example, 500 of the rescued accepted the rules, and within a week, envoys arrived from the southern communities of Delmar, which had been left without a leader or an army. By the end of the month, Aaron had 4,000 people at his command and control over all the lands from the southern floodplain to the scorched west, and the people were already calling the hill Dry Mountain, and without any ceremony, referring to him as the ruler. Aaron accepted this calmly, and that very night climbed the watchtower alone and unfolded the map. There were 33 days left until the long night. The white band in the north had grown closer and wider. It had already crept into the upper quarter of the map, and where it lay, the numbers blurred and seemed to breathe. For the first time since the day of the transfer, Aaron looked through his window into the future and saw in it a blind spot the size of a war. And from the depths of that blind spot, at the very limit of his talent's sensitivity, something was moving southward. Not a storm, not water, something alive and very large, and it was coming along with the cold. Aaron stood on a watchtower above 4,000 sleeping people who believed their ruler saw everything. He looked at the white streak and realized that the hardest part was only just beginning. Delmar had brought 800 fighters and demanded control of the hill, knowing about the blurred northern edge of the map. But Aaron had publicly and freely warned him about the landslide and flood that would come in 13 days, while Sila mocked the prophecy and the army remained in the floodplain. The storm arrived right on schedule. The landslide destroyed the camp. Aaron opened the gates and saved more than 500 enemies, after which Sila acknowledged her double mistake and together with the survivors and the southern communities, swore allegiance to the rules of the hill, while the crippled Delmar lost his strength and power. Aaron now had 4,000 men at his disposal, along with lands stretching to the floodplain and the scorched west. 33 days remained until the long night, and a white blind spot covered a quarter of the map, within which something enormous and alive was moving southward along with the cold. 33 days until the long night, and Holt laid out a calculation before Arena that silenced the council chamber. With 4,000 people on the hill and 40-degree frost, the hill's fuel supply would last only 8 days out of 20. Holt ran his finger along the lines and explained that wood burns quickly, but logs are needed for structural support, and that if they burned everything indiscriminately, by 10 o'clock at night people would start burning their homes, and by the 15th, they'd be burning each other. Orvin added a second problem. Walls and guards were built to protect against people and beasts that see with their eyes. According to the system, the creatures of the depths hunt in the dark, and no one knew exactly how they found their prey. Aaron himself pointed out a third problem. He told the council about the white band. His map was blank in the north, and the blind spot was growing along with the cold. Within the spot, something alive and large was moving southward. He said this in an even voice, and watched as the people, who were accustomed to their ruler seeing everything, learned to live with the fact that he did not see everything. Brant was the first to break the silence, saying that Aaron's eyes had guided them through water, fire, and fangs, and that even if his eyes now saw less clearly, the hill still had hands and heads. The council made 3 decisions. The first decision concerned the stone. It was impossible to survive 20 days on the surface at -40, even with fuel. They would have to live inside the mountain. Among the newcomers of the latest wave was a man named Tarek, a gifted earth digger who could sense rock the way a baker senses dough. Tarek listened to the plan to carve out halls in the hill for 4,000 people in a month and said outright that the plan was impossible. He said that the ventilation would kill them before the frost did, because 4,000 breaths and hundreds of fires would consume the air overnight, and that he'd been digging mines for 20 years and had buried those who thought a cave was just a hole in the rock. Aaron didn't argue. He led Tarek to an old riverbed and showed him a system of fissures running through the thickness of the hill, then asked him to test the draft with smoke. Tarek burned wet grass at the lower fissures for half a day, and by evening he returned with a different look on his face. The mountain was as full of holes as old cheese. Natural passages drew air from the bottom up through the entire mass of the hill. Tarek said that this was the first time he'd seen a mountain that had built its own lungs, that the plan was now feasible, and that he would carry it out. He was given 300 men and the authority to break down any walls. The second decision concerned fuel. There wasn't enough firewood, but to the west lay a burned-out forest. 20 kilometers of dead tree trunks turned into charcoal by the fire. Hauling charcoal from there was back-breaking work, but it burned twice as long as wood, and there were thousands of metric tons of it there. Holt did the math and said that if they hauled out 100 carts a day, they'd have enough fuel to last 30 days with a reserve by the deadline. The third decision concerned the north. The blind spot couldn't be seen, but it could be traversed on foot. Aaron sent a reconnaissance party of 20 of the best walkers north, and Sila volunteered to lead them, saying that a debt for a rescue isn't repaid with words. The following weeks condensed into a few scenes for the hill. The first scene was the underground. Tarek dug into the mountain according to his own rules, and the chambers grew one after another, and he personally sniffed the air in every dead end. The second scene was coal. Columns of carts, black with dust, crept in from the west from dawn until dusk, and the piles of coal against the northern wall grew like black hills. The third scene was food and water. The cisterns were insulated with stone and fat so the water wouldn't freeze, and the meat was moved to the cold upper chambers where the frost itself acted as a storekeeper. The fourth scene was people. Rumors of the mountain preparing for the night underground drew new crowds to the walls, and Aaron welcomed families with children and craftsmen, and by the end of the third week, the population had surpassed 5,000. Scylla returned on the 21st day and brought a stranger with her. The reconnaissance team had reached the edge of the blind spot and seen the cold with their own eyes. Scylla reported matter-of-factly, frost in the middle of the day, dead birds mid-flight, abandoned encampments of the northern communities, and in a cave they found the last survivor from the village of Cornerstone, a hunter named Irma. Irma stood before the council, frostbitten but upright, and recounted terrible things in an even voice. Her village of 300 people had been struck by the advancing cold a week earlier. Along with the cold came the creatures. Irma described them in detail. Whitish bodies as long as 2 horses, 6 legs, no eyes at all. The creatures are blind but can sense heat through walls and hear footsteps through the ground. Her settlement had been burning large bonfires for warmth, and the bonfires became beacons. The creatures were drawn to the heat like moths, and within 2 nights, Cornerstone was gone. Irma survived because she fell into an icy river, and her cold, wet clothes concealed her body heat. A creature passed just 3 steps away and didn't notice her. She said the most important thing: heat is death. Whoever warms themselves calls them. And then she said the second thing, and her voice faltered for the first time. The creatures she had seen were insignificant. They walked along the edges like dogs following a herd, and at night, a steady rumble like footsteps came from the north across the land, and the ice on the rivers cracked in time with those footsteps. The northern hunters had already given a name to the one who was coming. They called it the Shepherd of the Depths. The council was silent. Aaron looked at Irma, and a new picture of the night was taking shape inside his head. All the preparations on the hill were based on hearths and charcoal and the thousands of warm, living bodies inside the mountain. A mountain with 5,000 people would glow to the creatures like a bonfire in a field. He thanked Irma and offered her a spot, and she smiled without joy and replied that she would take a look at the place. She said that the Southerners had gathered a lot of food, and that was good, but that the Cornerstone had also gathered a lot of food, and no one needed that food now. She said she didn't believe that 5,000 pampered valley folk were capable of sitting as still as water for 20 days, and that she would stay simply because she had nowhere else to go. Aaron took this without offense. He needed someone who had seen the creatures alive, and such a person's skepticism was worth more than flattery. That very night, he gathered Tarek, Orvin, and Holt, and scrapped half of the plan they'd already drawn up. Tarek's chimneys were now supposed to spread the heat rather than vent it outward. The smoke and heat from the hearths were routed along a long path through kilometers of cold fissures, so that the mountain would exhale air that was barely warm and in dozens of places at once. The outer posts were moved to icy shelters without fire, with shifts changing every 2 hours. All the livestock had to be slaughtered by nightfall, because you can't teach animals to be quiet or cool them down. Holt clutched his head and recalculated the figures, and when work picked up again, Aaron opened the map in the evening for his usual check and froze. The white streak had leaped forward. In a single day, it had covered a distance that had previously taken 4 days. He recalculated the speed 3 times and arrived at the same answer. The cold was accelerating. The long night was coming, not in 12 days, as the previous calculation had promised. It was coming in 6 days. The mountain was losing a week of preparation, and so far, only one person knew about it. The hill was preparing for the long night, and Tarek had initially called the underground plan impossible, but admitted his mistake when it turned out the mountain had natural ventilation. Moreover, the fuel crisis was resolved by hauling coal from the burned-out forest, and the population had grown to 5,000. Sila's reconnaissance brought Irma, a hunter from the north, the sole survivor from the settlement, who reported that the blind creatures could sense heat through walls, and that a massive shepherd of the depths was approaching from the north. Irma herself did not believe the Southerners would survive the night. Arin revised his plan to mask the heat using chimneys that dispersed the heat, but the forecast showed that the cold was advancing faster, and night would come in 6 days instead of 12. 6 days instead of 12, and that meant a third of the work would never be finished, and Arin had to decide what to sacrifice. He announced the news to the council at dawn, and watched as the people went through the familiar cycle from disbelief to calculation. He had to make tough cuts on the fly. Tarek was ordered to abandon the partially excavated distant chambers and throw all forces into sealing off the completed ones. The coal columns were switched to round-the-clock operation with night shifts. The second wall was left unfinished. Holt struck the baths and the second-level communal kitchen from the plans, and the people learned that for 20 days they would have to wash with cold water from a bucket. No one argued. After the flood, the fire, and the lizards, Arena's word on deadlines carried more weight than a rock, and on the second day of the 6, disaster struck. One he had seen on the map, but underestimated in terms of scale. The accelerating cold drove not only birds before it, it drove people as well. All the communities in the strip between the mountain and the north broke camp at once and poured southward, and all roads led to the one place everyone in the valley was talking about, Dry Mountain. The sentries counted the arrivals by the hundreds, then stopped counting. In 2 days, nearly 2,000 people had reached the gates, frozen, starving, carrying children in their arms. The council met that night, and a rift ran right down the middle of the table. Holt, figures in hand, laid out the grim arithmetic. Supplies were calculated for 5,000 people. With 7,000, food that would have lasted half a year was now down to 3 months, and fuel reserves had lost a third of their range. Another 2,000 mouths to feed could drown them all. Orwin said that an untrained crowd in cramped halls meant panic, and panic underground was worse than the beasts. Irma sat in the corner and remained silent, with the air of someone who had already heard it all in the cornerstone. Arin listened to everyone and asked Holt how many people the mountain could accommodate if everyone accepted worked 16 hours a day until nightfall. Holt did the math and said that with a strict quota, and if they managed to get the coal in time, the limit would be 8,000. Arin said the limit would be 8,000. He went out to the gate and announced to those approaching the 3 rules of the hill and a 4th temporary rule. Until nightfall, every adult would work wherever they were told without question. Anyone who disagreed would receive 2 days' worth of food and leave. Of the 2,000, fewer than 100 left. The rest joined Holt's crew, and the next 4 days became the hardest work in the mountain's history. Scene 1. Newcomers with sleds and carts joined the coal columns, and the piles against the wall now grew twice as fast, while black dust settled into the faces of thousands of people. Scene 2. Women and the elderly sewed canopies from lizard hides over the entrances to the halls, and each hall was fitted with a triple vestibule to block drafts and sound. Scene 3. Against her own disbelief, Irma found herself at the center of the preparations. Arin assigned her the outer guard for training, and she drove Orvin's Scrades across the snow, teaching people things that made the Southerners' eyes pop out of their heads. Lying in an icy pit under a hide with the fur facing inward, breathing into the snow so the vapor wouldn't rise in a column, walking from heel to toe, rubbing lard on her face to prevent frostbite and ash to keep her skin from shining. She did this angrily and quickly, and in the evening she told Sile that she was teaching the dead to swim. Scene 4. The livestock was slaughtered in a single day, and the lower cold chamber filled with carcasses up to the ceiling. The last dogs were distributed throughout the halls, with orders to keep them close and feed them by hand, because a dog senses a creature before a man does, and a bark at the right moment is worth more than 100 centuries. On the fifth day, what Aaron had been waiting for and fearing happened. The leading beasts had outpaced the cold. A scout on the northern ridge signaled with a mirror, and Aaron, along with Irma and a dozen of Orvin's men, went out to look. Two whitish forms were moving across the snowy field 3 kilometers from the wall. Irma hadn't lied about a thing. 6 legs, blind muzzles. The creatures were moving in a strange zigzag pattern from point to point, and Aaron didn't understand at first, but then he did, and a chill ran through him. They were skirting the sites of yesterday's campfires left by the coal convoy. The heat had long since vanished, but the creatures could read even a cooled-down trail the way a dog reads an old scent. One creature stood over a fire pit, dug into it with its paw, and held its snout in the coals for a long time. Then both turned their heads toward the mountain that was breathing with thousands of people. For a minute there was silence, in which Aaron could hear his own heartbeat. Then the creatures turned and headed north, back the way they had come. Irma exhaled and said that this was a scouting party, and that the scouts would not return alone, but would bring a pack, just as had happened at the cornerstone. On the way back, she remained silent all the way to the gates, but at the gates, she suddenly stopped Aaron and said she had been half right. She said that the Southerners were still pampered, but that for the first time, she saw a leader who heeded the experience of others more readily than his own pride, and that at the cornerstone, there had been no such leader. This was her first concession, and Aaron accepted it in silence. On the last day before nightfall, the mountain closed up like a ship before a storm. Tarek went through all the halls and personally sealed off the extra exits. Holt posted the regulations and shift schedules on the walls. 8,000 people descended beneath the stone, and only Irma's hideouts and the frozen empty houses remained above. In the evening, Aaron climbed the watchtower one last time. The sky to the north was the wrong color. A greenish-gray haze was devouring the stars and creeping southward faster than the clouds, and the frost was already taking his breath away. He unfolded the map. A white band covered 2/3 of the radius, and deep within it, at the very limit of sensitivity, a massive form was moving steadily southward. Now, Aaron could at least estimate its size. The mass was 100 times larger than the biggest lizard. He turned off the map, went underground, and ordered the main vestibule to be closed behind him. Up above, the last light died out. The long night arrived 6 hours earlier than even his latest calculation, and for the first day, the mountain learned to live in whispers. People spoke in hushed tones. The hearths burned at half strength. Smoke drifted into the cracks of Tarek, and the mountain exhaled it, barely warm in 40 places. On the third day, the sentinel tapped out a prearranged signal on the frozen ground, and the mountain's heart contracted. Up above, in the dead little town, creatures were moving among the empty houses. Not just 2. Through the observation slit, Irma counted 11. The pack circled between the houses, rooting through old fire pits and listening. The mountain beneath them remained silent with all its might. 8,000 people sat in the darkness, speaking in hushed tones, holding their dogs by the muzzles and awaiting their verdict. The 12th creature, the largest of them all, stood directly above the main hall, froze, and remained there for an hour. Then the pack took flight and vanished into the darkness. Irma came down from her post, her face pale, not from the cold. She said that at the cornerstone, the pack had returned on the second night after such a reconnaissance, and that the mountains still smelled too faint for them to dig, but that this was only for now. And on the 5th night, through the thickness of the rock, all 8,000 people heard for the first time what only Irma had heard before: a steady, distant rumble through the earth. A step, a pause, a step. The shepherd of the depths had entered the valley. The shepherd's footsteps drew nearer for 2 days, and on the 7th night, for the first time in the entire history of the arena talent, the mountain entered the battle blindly. The white mist above had swallowed up almost the entire map, The forecast now provided only fragmented glimpses to the south, and Arena honestly told the council that his eyes were closed and that the people would be the ones to see beyond the mountain. He deployed what Orvin called a living forecast. 8 of Irma's scrads became eyes. The tapping on the frozen rock became a tongue. Tarek hung clay bowls of water in the upper tunnels. Their surface tremors revealed distant footsteps better than any ear. Holt compiled everything onto a single board in the command center, where the readings were updated every half hour. The mountain of the blind prophet had grown 100 foreign eyes. The shepherd went out to the town on the 8th night, and the very first report from a scout shattered all expectations. Irma relayed the measurements, but headquarters didn't believe her, so she tapped out the same numbers again. A body 60 paces long, as tall as a 3-story house, 8 legs as thick as a 100-year-old oak, a blind head the size of Holt's house, and around the head a collar of quivering whiskers, each 10 paces long. The shepherd was followed by an entourage. Irma counted about 100 whitish creatures clinging to the enormous body like dogs to a shepherd. The shepherd stood amid the empty houses and began to do something that sent a chill down the spines of those listening to the report. He was eating the town. The whiskers of his collar cracked open houses like nuts, and his blind head methodically searched every basement and every cellar. He was looking for warmth and food, and he did so with a terrifying, unhurried rationality. By 10 o'clock at night, the shepherd had eaten the town and lay down. He lay down in the square, 200 paces from the southern wall, and froze, while his retinue scattered to keep watch on the surrounding hills. Irma said what everyone had already figured out for themselves. The shepherd wasn't leaving. The shepherd sensed that there was great warmth somewhere nearby. Unable to pinpoint its exact location, he decided to wait. A siege without a single blow had begun. The nights that followed condensed into heavy scenes for the mountain. The first scene was silence. 8,000 people learned to live even more quietly. The forge was shut down. The children were gathered in the far halls behind triple curtains. They communicated through Irma's gestures, which spread throughout the mountain of their own accord. The second scene was the cold within. Aaron ordered the fire to be reduced by another quarter to weaken the mountain's breath, and the temperature in the halls dropped so much that the water in the mugs froze with a small ice cube, and people slept with 3 people under a single fur. The third scene was nerves. On the 12th night, in the 4th hall, a young mother's child began to cry out. The cry had already echoed beneath the vaults, and a neighbor was about to cover her mouth and swing at her when Brant got there first. He carried the screaming child to Tarek's dead-end alley, which was piled high with hides, and sat there with him and his mother until morning. In the morning, he emerged looking ashen, and said that for the first time, his stone skin had served him well from the inside. Upstairs that night, the shepherd raised his head, listened for an hour, and lay down again. The 4th scene was a test. The creatures of the retinue began digging methodically, not where the mountain was. They were digging into the distant coal piles by the northern wall, because the coal retained traces of old solar heat. One creature dug its way to the coal pile and pounded at it with its paws, scattering tons of coal, while Holt, at headquarters, stared at the board and counted aloud how many days of life this creature was scattering across the snow. And on the 14th night, something happened that upset the balance. Hideout number 3 on the northern ridge had been freezing for 2 days, and its relief team was making its way toward it through the fog. One of the replacements, within the last 100 steps, fell into a snow-filled gully, dislocated his leg, and couldn't suppress a brief cry. It was a single cry, and it was short. That was enough. A nearby creature picked up the sound and moved toward it, and 4 more turned to follow. The men managed to fall into the snow and freeze in place, but the creature stood over the gully and began to dig. What followed was a choice of the kind that leaves no room for any response. In hideout number 3 sat the senior hunter of the Northerners, a man named Callie. Through a crack, he saw that the creatures were digging just 3 steps away from the living men, and that in a minute his comrades would be torn open like a house. And Callie did what he himself had taught the young men never to do. He climbed out of the hide onto the ridge, stood up straight in the wind, spread his fur coat wide, and offered his body heat to the cold and the beasts. 5 beasts pounced on the new, bright target all at once. Callie ran along the ridge northward, away from the gully and the mountain, and ran for as long as he could. The beasts caught up with him on the far slope. The relief crew dragged the dislocated man back to the post and relayed the news up the mountain by word of mouth. Silence reigned in the headquarters hall, and Holt wrote Callie's name on the board alongside the word duty, while Irma stood motionless by the board, and then said that Callie was from Cornerstone, and that now the mountain had its first northern saint. Callie's death bought 3 peaceful nights and laid bare the greatest calamity. The people were hanging on by a thread. It was the 16th night out of 20, and Holt reported the remaining supplies to the closed council. At the current rate of consumption, fuel would last 7 days. According to his estimate, the people's patience would run out sooner. Whispers crept through the halls that the shepherd would not leave after the night was over, and that they would have to sit beneath the rock until they starved to death. And then Aaron laid on the table the plan he had been mulling over since the 10th night. A plan that caused Orvin to rise silently at first and pace the hall twice. The plan rested on 3 pillars. The first pillar was the only fragment of the forecast that the white mist still allowed Aaron to see. The southern edge of the map was active and showed that on the 19th night, a final warm air current would approach from the south beneath the mist and collide with the northern cold directly over the valley, giving rise to a storm at their junction. Not just any storm. The map depicted a blizzard, with winds strong enough to knock you off your feet, and a wall of snow so thick you couldn't see your hand. For humans, this meant certain death out there, but the beasts did not see with their eyes. The beasts saw with heat and heard with the earth. And the blizzard, with its wet southern snow, was set to blanket the world in a single temperature and a single continuous roar. For several hours, the shepherd's retinue would be deafened and blinded. The second leg was a decoy. The shepherd was waiting for intense heat. He would get it, not in the mountains. 2 kilometers to the west, in the ravine familiar to everyone, where they used to burn lizards. There, on the night of the blizzard, the sled would head with the third of the remaining coal and barrels of fat, and the ravine would flare up with the brightest heat of this winter, and amid the roar of the blizzard, that heat would be the only thing the creatures could sense. The third leg was a trap, and Aaron spoke of it slowly because he himself was afraid of his own words. You can't kill the shepherd with iron. But on the 19th day, just before the blizzard, the forecast promised a brief drop in temperature to -55. An old riverbed ran through the ravine, and above it, dating back to the time of the lizards, stood a dam of meltwater that had never been dismantled in the fall. If the shepherd entered the burning ravine in search of warmth, and if the dam were breached at that very moment, the water would flood the ravine up to the knees of his 8 legs, and the -55 frost, combined with hurricane-force winds, would freeze that water solid in a matter of minutes. The mountain would not kill the shepherd. The mountain would freeze him solid. The council was silent for a long time. Then Orvin said that the plan hinges on the storm arriving right on schedule in the blind spot where Aaron's talent doesn't work. Aaron replied that the storm would be born from the southern heat, and his map sees the south clearly, and that this would be the first time he'd stake 8,000 lives not on his vision, but on his calculations. Irma asked who would drive the sled loaded with coal into the hurricane's maw. Aaron replied that he himself would drive the sleigh, and that's when the council erupted for the first time all night. The council forbade Aaron from going with the sleigh, and for the first time in the mountain's history, his word was openly challenged, and he relented halfway. Orvin spoke harshly and with military simplicity. The ruler is the head, and you don't send the head to test a trap. If the sled vanishes in the blizzard, the mountain will lose its cargo and its people, and that will be a wound. If Aaron perishes, the mountain will lose its vision and its will, and that will be death. Irma put it more succinctly. She said that many know how to carry warmth, but only one knows how to see the south. They settled on a compromise. Brant and Irma lead the convoy, along with 20 volunteers from the Northerners and the best runners. Aaron takes up his post at the top of the dam, from where the ravine is visible through the gaps in the storm, and his tap on the wall determines the moment the water strikes. Scylla guards the wall in case even a single creature from the blizzard makes its way up the mountain. The 3 days leading up to the deadline condensed into a series of brief scenes. The sleds were overhauled and their runners were reinforced with bone. The coal was transferred into leather sacks so it wouldn't rattle. Along the entire route to the ravine, a rope with knots was frozen into the snow. Because in a wall of snow, one navigates by feel rather than by sight. Tarek and his team went to the dam and spent 3 days chiseling channels into the ice and frozen clay, laying a weak line along which the wall of water was supposed to burst from a dozen blows with sledgehammers. Holt silently handed over a third of the remaining fuel to the supply train, and that evening told Aaron that for the first time he was authorizing an expenditure that would either save everyone or kill everyone, and that the numbers don't like that sort of thing. On the 18th day, the shepherd stirred. He rose from the plaza and moved along the southern wall, his mustache tracing the masonry like the fingers of a blind man across a stranger's face. Twice, he froze in front of the bricked-up old entrances and began to press, and the masonry groaned, and sand trickled from the ceiling into the tunnels. The mountain stood still, down to the last man. By morning, the shepherd had moved away and lain down again, but it became clear to everyone at headquarters that the beast's patience would run out before the people's fuel did, and that the 19th night was not a choice, but the final door. Aaron spent the 19th day at the southern edge of the map, not letting go of the forecast for even an hour. The warm current flowed as promised. By evening, it had collided with the northern cold, and the southern part of the map boiled. At the very edge of sight, a storm was born and crept toward the valley. Aaron gave the order, and the mountain exhaled the caravan outward. After that, everything was as murky as black water. The frost struck first. The wind brought temperatures down to -55, and the air began to cut at their throats like sand. The caravan moved along the frozen rope, and Aaron, with 2 messengers, lay by the dam in a pit under the firs, listening for tapping sounds. The storm struck 2 hours later, and it was like the sky collapsing. The wind fell like a wall, and the world ended 3 steps away. Amid that roar, Brant and Irma pulled the sleds to the using the knots in the rope with just one hand. They laid out the coal in 3 rows along the bottom, poured fat over it, and Irma lit it from the coals in the pot. The log caught fire, and even through the hurricane, that warmth rose above the valley like a single word in an empty book. The beasts heard it all at once. The messenger by the lower rock tapped out a message that the retinue was coming down from the hills and heading west past the mountain. And then the earth spoke the most important thing: a step. A pause, a step. The shepherd stood up and walked toward the fire. The caravan was rushing out of the ravine along the rope, and 100 paces from the exit, the storm took its toll. A gust knocked the rear trio off their feet, and one of the northerners was hurled onto the rocks and broken. And Brant returned and carried him on his shoulder the last half-kilometer through a wall of snow. The shepherd entered the ravine behind him. He slipped into it with his whole body, like a key fitting into a lock, and lay belly down on the burning ridges, wriggling to gather the heat beneath him, while his retinue huddled at the edges of the ravine above their master. Aaron lay by the dam, keeping track of the taps, the map, and the time all at once in his head. He had to wait until the beast settled down in the warmth and loosened its collar. And he couldn't wait long because the coal beneath it was burning through. He counted down to his appointed time and struck the frozen ice with a prearranged tap. Sledgehammers soared up from Tarek's trenches. 12 men struck along a weak line in 4 rounds of blows, and on the 40th blow, the dam creaked and burst. Water surged along the old channel in a wall as tall as a man. It rushed into the ravine beneath the shepherd's belly and struck the steam, and the steam mingled with the blizzard, and for a moment there was nothing left in the world but the loud roar. The shepherd roared for the first time in all those nights. The sound traveled through the earth, so that children on the mountain in the distant halls began to cry. The beast lunged forward, and the water was already up to his knees. The 55-degree frost, combined with the wind, did its work faster than a heart could beat. The water was freezing before his eyes. The shepherd tore his legs free from the slush of ice, and every leg he pulled out immediately sank into a new patch. His own weight pressed him into the freezing beam, and his body heat melted the ice beneath his belly, only for the frost to freeze his belly back in place at once. His retinue scurried along the edges, blinded by the hurricane, and scrambled down toward their master, freezing solid beside him. By midnight, the roar had grown fainter and less frequent. By the pre-dawn hour, the earth had stopped trembling. The storm ran out of steam by dawn of the 20th day, and on the 20th day, according to the long night system, it was supposed to end, and it did. The mist in the sky thinned and broke apart, and for the first time in 20 days, the sun rose over the valley. It rose over the white plain and over the ravine, and everyone who had climbed the wall saw what lay in the ravine. The shepherd of the depths stood frozen in the ice up to his belly. His enormous body was still breathing. Its blind head lay on the ice, and the whiskers on its muzzle twitched faintly, like grass beneath the ice. Half of its retinue was frozen into the ice around it, while the other half had set out northward during the night, and their trail had melted away along with the mist. They finished it off throughout the day. Spears pierced the whitish body, and the body died slowly and silently. And Aaron forbade them to rejoice while the beast was still breathing. Irma was the last to descend into the ravine. She stood for a long time before the blind head, which was the size of a house. Then she took off her mitten and placed her bare palm on the frozen snout, standing there in the cold until her hand turned white. She returned to the wall, found Aaron with her eyes, and said in front of everyone that she was taking back her words about the dead whom she had taught to swim. She said that Cornerstone had perished because it had sought warmth and screamed, while Dry Mountain had survived because its ruler knew how to remain silent, to calculate, and to weigh his own life against the lives of all. She said that Northerners know how to swear an oath only once, and she swore it. All the rescued Northerners knelt behind her, and Aaron watched this, feeling not pride, but the terrible exhaustion of 20 days all at once. In the evening, Holt reported the toll of the night. 36 people had perished. Kale, those who had suffered frostbite, those crushed during the relocation of the masonry, and one Northerner from the supply train who had not survived until morning. There was enough fuel left for 2 days, and if not for the victory, the mountain would have begun to grow cold the day after tomorrow. Aaron listened and ordered 36 names to be carved into the stone by the gate. The first on the list, which he commanded must never be discontinued. And at midnight, when the mountains slept soundly for the first time in 20 days, with fires burning in the hearths flared up over the valley, the system spoke to the entire continent. The voice announced that the second cycle of purification was complete. That of the 12,000 who had been transported, 4,200 were alive, and that the living were stronger than any previous generation had ever been. The voice announced rewards for the settlements that had endured the night, calling them bastions and naming their number. Across the entire continent, 5 bastions remained. And when the voice named Dry Mountain the strongest of the 5 and spoke aloud the name of its ruler, Aaron stood on the wall, not looking up at the sky. He looked south, east, and west, where, under the same sky, 4 other rulers were listening to that same voice. Rulers who had just learned who was first. The council did not allow Aaron to go with the supply train. Brant and Irma led the decoy, while he himself, from his post at the dam at the predicted hour of the storm, set fire with his bare hands to a log in the supply train filled with 1/3 of the fuel, lured the shepherd into the warmth, and the collapsed dam, at -55, froze the beast into the ice, where it was finished off after dawn. The night cost 36 lives, including Kala's, and nearly all the fuel, while Irma publicly retracted her words, and the Northerners swore allegiance to Arena. The system declared the end of the second cycle. 4,200 people and 5 bastions had survived on the continent, and it named Dry Mountain the strongest, naming its ruler by name, and now the other 4 rulers know of him. The system's reward fell upon the mountain that morning after the announcement, and along with the reward came knowledge that outweighed all the gifts combined. The system awarded survival points to every resident of the bastion, and the mountain awoke rich. Holt spent the morning compiling the records, walking around with the expression of someone counting someone else's dreams. But the main reward came to Aaron personally. The system reported that the forecast talent had been raised 1 level for its contribution to survival. The radius had grown from 50 kilometers to 150. The depth had increased from 30 days to 60. Aaron closed his eyes, and the world expanded to 3 times its width and twice its distance. For the first few minutes, he simply breathed, acclimating himself like a man who had stepped out of a cramped room into an open field. Then he began to look around, and he saw 3 things. The first thing was good. For the next 60 days, mercy would reign over his lands. Early spring, steady rains, no floods, no fires, no migrations. The system had given the survivors a respite, and the map confirmed this with 99% accuracy. The second thing was unfamiliar. The new radius extended to lands Aaron had never seen before, and to the east, 120 kilometers away, the map showed a vast body of water, a chain of lakes the size of a sea. And on the isthmus between the lakes, the map marked the dense, living warmth of thousands of people. The eastern bastion stood there, and now Aaron could see its weather as clearly as his own. The third thing was bad, and lay at the very bottom of the 60th day. At the limit of the new depth of vision, all the layers of the map trembled at once. It was not a storm, nor water, nor cold. The earth itself was trembling. The forecast drew a jagged grid across the entire radius at once, and Aaron checked it 3 nights in a row, getting the same result each time. On the 60th day, an earthquake of such magnitude awaited the continent that the map could not find a color to represent it. He noted this in his personal log and decided to keep quiet until the deadline, because panic 2 months before the deadline kills, or rather, the tremors do. Meanwhile, the mountain was experiencing its first peaceful spring, and spring condensed into a few fleeting images. The first scene was a construction site. Tarek was transforming the underground halls into a real city with wells of light, and Dry Mountain was being encircled by a second ring of stone walls built from beams. The second scene was the land. The southern floodplain, fertilized by the flood and the landslide, was plowed for the first harvest, and Aaron marked the sowing dates on the map to coincide with the rains. The old farmers nodded their heads and sowed day after day, and the seedlings sprouted as if on command, because they were, in fact, planted on command. The third scene was authority. 8,000 people could not be ruled by the voice of a single man, so Aaron divided authority into parts. Holt received the treasury and accounting, Orvin, the army, Tarek, stone and water, Selah, roads and patrols, Irma, the North, and hunting. The Council of Six met once a week and argued until they were hoarse, and Aaron learned to lose the minor disputes in the council in order to win the major ones. The fourth scene was of a man on crutches. Delmar had been recovering all winter in the common halls, where no one bothered him, and in the spring he came to Aaron on his own. He stood upright on his crutches and said that his power had ended in the mud under the canopy, and that he had not come to ask for power. He said that he was the best at one craft on the entire continent, negotiating, and that a ruler who sees storms ahead has no one who knows how to speak to people who can neither be drowned nor frozen. Aaron thought it over for 2 days and consulted with the council, but the council was divided, and the deciding vote came from Scylla, who had known Delmar longer than anyone else. She said that Delmar was as deceitful as a merchant, but that a merchant without goods does not lie, and his only commodity now was his usefulness to Aaron. Delmar was given a small negotiating table and correspondence with the surviving free communities, and within a month he brought 4 distant settlements, not a single spear among them, under his control. And on the 40th day of spring, guests arrived from the east, and it became clear that the respite would end before the 60th day. The Sayla patrol met the embassy on the eastern road, 30 riders on unfamiliar gray beasts under a turquoise banner bearing a wave. The embassy of the Lake Bastion. It was led by a woman named Mara, with calm eyes and speech as smooth as water. The council received her in the new upper hall, and Mara spoke eloquently. She congratulated the continent's mightiest bastion. She conveyed an invitation from her ruler, whom she called the Lord of 1,000 Lakes, and whose name was Galen. Galen was convening a congress of the 5 bastions on neutral ground near the rift in midsummer to negotiate borders, trade, and how to move forward on a continent where only 4,000 people remained. And amid these smooth words, Mara laid 3 stones. The first stone was knowledge. She said that Galen, with his gift of deep hearing, could hear the earth, and that lately the earth had been speaking to him with alarm. As she spoke, she looked Aaron in the eyes, and Aaron realized that Galen too had sensed the 60th day, and that the Congress was not being convened to discuss trade. The second stone was power. Mara mentioned, almost in passing, that the Lake Bastion had accepted the free communities of the East after the night, and that Galen now had 1,400 men at his disposal, along with a fleet on the lakes. Dry Mountain was the strongest force, but not the only one, and they had been politely reminded of this. The third stone was a hook. As she was saying goodbye, Mara mentioned that Galen had asked her to convey a message personally. He asked her to say that the man who sees the sky and the man who hears the earth are stronger together than apart, and that apart, both of them face a fate they both already suspect. The embassy departed for the east, while the council sat in session until late into the night. Orvin argued that the summit was a trap because having all 5 rulers in one place made them too easy a target. Delmar argued that the summit was the only table at which half a continent could be secured without war, and that not attending meant handing that table over to Galen. Holt calculated the costs of the journey and security. Irma remained silent, then asked Aron point blank what the 2 rulers suspected. And Aron realized that the time for silence was over. He unfolded a map of the 60th day before the council and spoke of the tremors affecting all strata, of the grid of fissures, and of how his new depth of vision hit a wall on that day. He said he didn't know what it was, but he knew when it would happen, and that Galen had scheduled the Congress at the Rift 10 days ahead of schedule, and that this was no coincidence. The council remained silent, and everyone's faces bore the same expression. The people who had survived water, fire, Fangs, and the Knight realized that all of this had merely been a preparatory phase. The decision was made toward morning. The mountain is heading to the convention. Aaron, Delmar, Irma, and 50 of Orvan's guards, and the mountain itself, for the duration of the trip, is placed under the protection of Selah and Holt. Before departure, all excess grain is moved to deep storage vaults, and Tarek begins quietly reinforcing the vaults of the lower city against the tremors, a fact known only to the council for now. Before going to sleep, Aaron opened the map one last time and did what he now did every night. He looked toward the very edge of the 60th day and listened for the tremor. And that night, for the first time, through the tremor, he made out a single point at the very center of the grid of rifts. A point where the rifts converged like threads into a knot. The point lay neither on his lands nor on Galen's. It lay exactly where Galen was summoning the 5 rulers, on neutral ground near the rift. Aaron stared for a long time at the knot of the future rift beneath the site of the future Congress, and realized that he was traveling either to negotiate the continent's salvation or to the very center of its destruction, and that, most likely, it was the same place and the same time. He turned off the map. There were 26 days left until the Congress, 36 until the 60th day. The mountains slept below, warm and alive, and 8,000 breaths rose through the cracks of Tarek into the spring sky. And for the first time since the day of the transfer, Aaron caught himself thinking that he wasn't afraid for himself. The system's reward had expanded Aaron's talent to a radius of 150 kilometers and a depth of 60 days, and he saw a peaceful spring, the lake bastion to the east, and at the very edge of his vision, the gigantic earthquake of the 60th day, about which he had remained silent until then. The mountain rebuilt itself, opened up the floodplain, received the Council of Six's advice, and Delmar returned as a negotiator, bringing 4 settlements without war. An embassy from the Lord of 1,000 Lakes, Galen, who possessed the talent of deep hearing, invited the 5 bastions to a congress at the Rift 10 days before the catastrophe, and Aaron revealed the forecast to the council and discovered that the focal point of future ruptures lay precisely beneath the congress site, where he is now traveling with Delmar, Irma, and leaving the mountain to Sale and Holt for safekeeping. The journey to the Rift took 12 days, and by the 3rd day, Aaron realized that he would arrive at the Congress not as the leading player, but as a target for the other 4. This realization came through Delmar. In the evenings by the campfire, the negotiator would lay out the balance of power before Aaron and Irma, just as a merchant displays his wares. 5 bastions meant 5 talents elevated by the system to the next level. Galen hears the earth. The ruler of the southern bastion, a woman named Ashera with the talent Green Palm, increased harvest and healed the land. Under her rule, the south was the only region where people had enough to eat. The western bastion was ruled by a man named Corvus with the talent Steel Swarm, who was worth a whole squad on his own and kept his people in line through fear. The northern bastion was the least known of all. It was called the Nest and was ruled by a 14-year-old girl named Yuna, who possessed the talent 1,000 voices and could speak with animals and birds. Her bastion had survived the night, though no one knew how. Delmar said that each of the 4 would arrive at the convention with a single question on their mind. Why is the man who merely sees the weather called the strongest? And that everyone would search the arena for a weakness, and upon finding it, would try to buy it or break it. Irma listened while sharpening her knife and said that in the north, such guests were met with an arrow from the mist. Delmar replied that this was precisely why the north was the only bastion of the 4 to survive. The road condensed into a few scenes. The caravan traveled through the deadlands of the first year, and living scenes were rare. The burnt-out remains of settlements, bones by the old fords. Twice they encountered free communities of 30 or 40 people, and Delmar would stop and speak to them, leaving them salt and grain along with the message that Dry Mountain welcomes all who accept its rules. On the 9th day of the journey, the ground trembled beneath their feet for the first time. The tremor was as gentle as a sleeper's sigh, but the horses reared up, and the birds took flight from the entire plain at once. Aaron unfolded the map. There were 27 days left until the 60th, and the web of fissures at the edge of their vision grew denser. At the junction beneath the rift, the tremors no longer ceased, neither day nor night. The earth began to speak aloud what he had been reading in silence for 2 months. The rift opened on the 12th day, and even the horses fell silent at the sight of it. Across the plain, a fissure 200 paces wide and as deep as the darkness. It stretched from north to south to the horizons, and steady, warm air rose from its depths, carrying the scent of stone and iron. The neutral land of the Congress lay on the western edge of the fissure. An old, round rock with a flat summit already had 4 camps standing atop it, each under its own banner. Galen's turquoise wave, Ashera's green branch, Corvus's black wedge, and the Nest's gray wing. The Dry Mountain camp was the 5th to be set up, and that very evening, the event for which Delmar had traveled 12 days began. The assembly opened in the morning within a circle of 5 stone seats that someone had hewn here long before the relocation, and Galen was the first to speak. The Lord of 1,000 Lakes turned out to be an elderly, broad-shouldered man with bottomless eyes, and he spoke so softly that everyone had to lean toward him. He said he had gathered the living not to divide the continent, but to save it. He said he had been hearing the earth all his life, and that for the past 6 months, the earth beneath the continent had sounded like ice beneath one's feet just before it breaks. He turned to Aaron and asked, in front of everyone, what a man who sees the sky sees in the depths of his days. Aaron stood up and spoke the truth, because he had calculated that a lie would backfire, and the truth was worth more. He said that in 24 days, an earthquake would strike the continent, one for which his map could not find a color, and that the convergence of fault lines was gathering right beneath this very spot. The circle fell silent. Then Corvus laughed, and his laughter was cold as iron. He said that the 2 seers had conspired ahead of the convention and were frightening the others in order to seize power over everyone through fear. He said that the West fears no tremor, and that the steel swarm fears nothing. Ashera didn't laugh. She said that her land had been sick for a month now, that the roots were dying from below, and that she'd thought it was poison from the depths. But now she was hearing an explanation worse than poison. Una remained silent, staring at Erin without blinking, and that gaze was unsettling, because it wasn't a girl looking at her, but hundreds of creatures through her eyes. For 3 days, the gathering unfolded like a war without weapons. Delmar wove nets day and night. He struck a deal with Ashera's people to exchange grain for predictions of sowing days. He found common ground with the lake people regarding salt, fish, and boats. He even drank by the campfire with the people of Corvus and returned with the valuable insight that the West was starving and that Corvus's fear was sustained by empty granaries. And on the 3rd night, Una came to Arena's tent. Alone and unescorted, Orvan's sentries didn't spot her until she was already standing at the entrance, and Irma later swore that the girl had slipped through the camp like a shadow. Una sat down by the fire and spoke in a steady voice that didn't sound like a child's. She said that her birds had flown over the rift, deeper and deeper, as long as they had enough air, and that it wasn't empty down there. She said that animals had been fleeing these places for a month now, and that yesterday even the mice had left the cliff of descent. And then she said the most important thing. The voices they hear down below, beneath the continent, are neither stone nor water. They hear a dream. Something is sleeping beneath the rift, and tossing and turning, and every tremor is it turning over in its sleep. And on the 60th day, according to Aaron's count, it won't strike. It will wake up. Aaron sat motionless, piecing together her words in his mind with his map and Irma's story about the shepherd who walked with the cold like a shepherd with his flock. And the question he hadn't asked back then now loomed large. Which flock was it, and whose shepherd was he? Una got up to leave, turned around, and said she had come to Aaron and not to Galen because the birds had seen winter. The birds had seen the man who had led 8,000 out of the night and opened the gates to the enemies. She said that the nest was small and made decisions simply. The nest would be wherever that man was. The next morning, everything fell apart. That night, the earth gave its first real tremor. The rock face of the descent swayed, and on the eastern edge, in the rift, a section of the wall collapsed. And from the depths, for the first time, a sound reached all 5 camps. A long, low exhalation, as if from a throat the size of a gorge. And by morning, within the circle of the 5, there were no more disputes over power. There was fear, and Galen played his hand on that fear. He stood up and said that there was no time for alliances of equals, and that the continent needed one voice and one will until the day of disaster. He proposed a simple solution. All the bastions would come under a single authority for a year, and that authority must belong to the one who hears the disaster itself. To him. And the man who sees the sky would stand second to him, and the eyes and ears of the continent would be in one pair of hands. He spoke sensibly, and his voice was like warm water, and Aaron saw how Asher slowly nodded, and how Corvus, to whom Galen had clearly promised something that night, weighed the benefits. 4 voices against one were taking shape before their eyes. And then Aaron stood up and made a move that even Delmar hadn't anticipated. He agreed that there must be a single will, and he proposed to determine whose will it was, not with words, but through a test that couldn't be bought. Let each of the 2 seers, in full view of everyone, record what would happen to the earth and the sky over the next 3 days, hour by hour. The records were to be sealed and opened on the 3rd evening, and let the continent itself see whose vision was more accurate, and believe that one on the day of disaster. The circle buzzed with excitement. Galen smiled for the first time since the convention began, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. He could hear the earth deep within, but the earth did not speak to him of hours or numbers. To refuse in front of everyone would mean admitting this, he agreed. Aaron returned to his tent, sat down over the map, and began to write the most important prediction of his life, knowing that in 3 days he would either become the voice of the continent or lose everything, including the right to warn the people about what lay dormant beneath their feet. 3 days of competition would decide who would lead the continent on the day of its awakening, and Aaron wrote his forecast all night long until the gray dawn. He wrote down the times and numbers. Tremors, tomorrow at noon and at sunset, with a force strong enough to rock the cauldrons, but not topple the tents. Light rain from the southwest on the evening of the 2nd day, lasting 3 hours. Wind on the 3rd day, shifting to the north by noon. Dew. Fog in the lowlands of the rift at dawn on the 2nd day. He reached the last line of the 3rd day, and his hand paused. The map indicated that on the 3rd evening, 1 hour before the records were to be opened, there would be a tremor stronger than any previous ones, causing the southern ledge of the descent cliff to collapse. He recorded this as well, specifying the time and location of the collapse, and added that people on the southern ledge must be evacuated in advance. In the morning, both sheets were sealed in clay, in the presence of 5 witnesses from the 5 bastions, and placed on a stone in the center of the circle under joint guard. Galen handed over his sheet calmly, and Aaron managed to notice that Lord Ozer's sheet was short. 3 days had been condensed into a list of events that had come to pass. The midday tremor struck at noon. The sunset tremor came at sunset. The cauldrons swayed. The tents held firm, and the people of the 5 camps began to exchange glances. Fog settled at dawn on the second day, precisely in the lowlands. Rain came by evening on the second day and fell for 3¼ hours, and Delmar walked through the camps, remaining silent with an expression that made his silence speak louder than words. By the third day, people from all the camps were already trailing behind Aaron, asking about tomorrow's weather, simply to hear him answer without hesitation. And an hour before the opening, Aaron stood in the middle of the circle and loudly asked everyone to leave the southern ledge. Corvus pointedly remained standing on the ledge with his guards, and said he would not move at the word of the rain prophet. Ashera led her people away. Galen hesitated, and then led his people away. A quarter of an hour before the appointed time, Irma silently took Corvus's very own fear from his hands. She climbed onto the ledge, stood beside him, and said she would be delighted to watch up close as a man who argues with the schedule dies. Corvus held her gaze for a minute, and then climbed down from the ledge with his entire guard, grumbling that he was fleeing from a crazy northerner, not from a prophecy. The tremor struck at the appointed hour. The southern ledge broke off entirely and plunged into the rift with a roar that made the horses cower. And where Corvus had stood a quarter of an hour earlier, there was no longer a single stone. Only dust remained. It was in this dust that they uncovered the clay. Galen's scroll was honest and profound and almost blank. He wrote that the earth would tremble 3 times and that trouble was growing below. No hours, no numbers, no ledge. They read Arena's scroll aloud, line by line, and after each line, someone in the crowd would call out what had come to pass. When the reader reached the line about the ledge and the hour, the crowd could no longer contain itself and began to murmur. Corvus stood in the front row, gazing at the jagged edge of the cliff, and his face took on the expression that Aren had seen many times before. The face of a man whose worldview is shifting. He was the first to step forward. He said in front of everyone that he had laughed twice, and that both times he had been kept alive only by the mercy of others. The first time was when he didn't go to see the beam with the frozen beast because he didn't believe in it. The second time was a quarter of an hour ago. He said that the steel swarm can cut through everything except the future, and that the West stands behind whoever reads that future by the clock. Ashera agreed next, and her agreement smelled of relief. Galen spoke last. He had lost, and lost publicly, and Aaron expected venom, but the Lord of the Lakes surprised him. He said that for 40 years he had listened to the earth and learned to hear what was most important in it, the truth, and that right now, the truth sounded like this. The sky turned out to be more precise than the earth. He was the first to name Aaron the voice of the continent until the end of the calamity, and added quietly that he had one condition, and that he would state it in private. That night, the two of them spoke alone at the edge of the rift. Galen said that he was relinquishing power not out of nobility, but out of calculation. And this was his reasoning. His deep-seated intuition told him that what sleeps below cannot be killed. It is older than the continent. The system did not create it, but awakened it through its cycles, and catastrophes are its waking dreams. Galen asked what a man who could see 60 days into the future proposed to do. And Aaron replied that during those 3 days at the node of the rifts, he had seen one more thing that he had kept silent about. The pattern of future rifts was not chaos. It was a channel. The rifts ran from the node eastward toward the Thousand Lakes, and the map showed more than just tremors on the 60th day. It showed how Galen's lakes were flowing down into the fissures that had opened up. Billions of metric tons of cold water into the scorching bed of the sleeper. Aaron said he didn't know if it was possible to kill whatever was down there, but he knew that water had once already saved them from the unkillable. The shepherd wasn't killed by iron. He was stopped by water and cold. And if whatever lies below awakens in the dry heat, it will rise and march forth. But if it awakens in an ocean of icy water that is poured into its lair, there's a chance that its awakening will end in drowning, or at least that it will fall asleep again for centuries. Galen was silent for a long time. Then he said that Aaron was not asking him to give up his power. Aaron was asking him to give up his lakes, his homeland, his stronghold, the 1,000 lakes that fed his people and for which he had amassed power, to drain them down the throat of the underground god, according to the calculations of a stranger's talent. Aaron replied that he wasn't asking, he was showing. On the 60th day, the lakes will sink anyway, because fissures will form beneath them, and the map has already shown this. The choice is not between lakes and no lakes. The choice is between a spontaneous outflow of water, which would simply enrage the Awakening One, and a controlled release of all the water at once, at the right hour and to the right spot. To do this, they must, in the remaining 20 days, cut through and line the guide channels from the southern chain of lakes to the main fissure and bring down the bridges all at once. Aaron will set the time. Only all 5 bastions working together can get the job done. Galen stood above the black abyss from which rose the warm breath of the sleeper. Then he said that 20 years ago he had buried his wife, and that since then he had never once made a decision with his heart, and that today he would decide by calculation, as always. Calculation said that the dead bastion of the lake was unnecessary. He agreed. The next morning, the circle of 5 gathered for the last time, and Aaron spoke to the continent for the first time as its voice. He told them everything, about the sleeper, about the water, about the 20 days. He assigned the work among the bastions. Galen's people in the boats are marking out the channels on the water. Corvus's swarm is cutting the stone of the bridges to the calculated thickness. Ashera's south feeds everyone, and her hand holds the scree in place with its roots. Yuna's birds and beasts carry news between the sites faster than any messenger. Dry Mountain provides the timekeeping instruments, and Tarek, who alone understands how to break the stone so that it shatters at the exact right moment. Delmar remains at the junction to merge the 5 camps into one. There were no objections. After the cornice collapsed, no one wanted to object to the schedule. The camps were packed up and headed east toward the lakes, and Aaron stood at the edge of the rift with Irma, looking down. Irma asked what would happen if the sleeper woke up before the scheduled time. Aaron answered honestly that then there would be nothing, neither the schedule nor the continent. That evening, he opened the map and checked the node, just as he did every night. And he saw something new. The tremor in the node had changed its rhythm. Before, it had been as steady as a breath. Now it had pauses and lulls, like a sleeper dreaming that someone had come for him. 19 days remained until the 60th day. For the first time ever, the map displayed 2 symbols at the end of the line instead of the precision number, symbols that Aaron had never seen before. The system didn't know how to draw a question mark. It simply left a blank space. Aaron won the forecasting contest by fulfilling everything down to the hour, including the collapse of the southern ledge from which Irma had led the stubborn Corvus away. After that, Corvus and Ashera acknowledged him, and Galen was the first to call Aaron the voice of the continent. In private, Galen learned of Aaron's plan to strike at the hour of awakening by directing all the water of the 1,000 lakes into the lair of the sleeper through the guide channels, since the lakes were doomed to flow into the fissures anyway, and after careful calculation, agreed to sacrifice the bastion's homeland. 5 bastions were assigned roles in the 20-day canal construction project, and Arena's map showed that the sleeper's breathing had become ragged. At the end of the forecast, a void appeared for the first time in place of the precision number. 19 days were needed to turn 1,000 lakes into weapons, and already on the first day of construction, the Arena realized that they would have to fight against more than just rock. All 4,000 survivors of the continent worked together, regardless of their banners, something that had never happened before. The southern chain of lakes lay 40 meters above the main fissure, and from there to the rift, they would have to cut 3 guide channels with a total length of 11 kilometers, and leave 3 cross bridges of calculated thickness in each one, so they could be brought crashing down all at once. The construction project unfolded in several scenes. The first scene was the swarm. Corvus proved to be as formidable at work as he was in battle. His steel swarm hung over the crossbeams like a silver cloud and cut through the rock with palm-width precision, according to Tarek's markings. And Tarek, who had come to him to accept the work for the first time in his life, said he could see the tool better than his own hands. The second scene was the roots. Where the canals ran through the scree, Asher would sit barefoot on the ground and press her palms into the earth, and overnight the slopes would be crisscrossed by a network of white roots that held the stone in place better than piles. She was aging before our eyes from this work, yet she never stopped. The third scene was of voices. Yuna's birds carried calculations between sites in a matter of minutes, and her wolves patrolled on watch. Once, within an hour, a flock of her ravens found a hidden cavity in the body of the second bridge that would have brought the entire structure crashing down. And after that, Tarek bowed to the ravens as if they were people. The fourth image was of clocks. Aren lived between the map and the markings. Tremors now occurred daily, and each tremor shifted the cracks. Every night he recalculated the time of impact and the thickness of the crossbeams, and sent out corrections in the morning. On the 8th day of construction, disaster struck from within. At night, on the third channel, a temporary dam broke, and water poured into the unfinished channel, submerging the equipment and nearly drowned the work crew. Worst of all, it eroded the bed so severely that the channel's design calculations went out the window. An inspection revealed that the dam hadn't been torn away. It had been cut down. The camp ground to a halt. 4,000 people, with 9 days left until the end of the world, were searching for the traitor, and fear had made them deaf to reason. Corvus demanded that all the bastions be subjected to a general search, and his swarm was already hovering over the tents. Galen remained heavy-hearted and silent, and then Delmar's network, which he had been quietly weaving since the day of the Congress, sprang into action. His people, who knew how to listen, found a trail within a day. There were 3 who had cut the damper, and they were not anyone's spies. They were a cult. Over the months of catastrophe, a belief had taken root among the survivors that the one sleeping below was the true master of the world, that the system was merely his dream, and that to interfere with his awakening would bring about the worst. The 3 believers decided that bringing water into the lair was sacrilege. They were captured at night without bloodshed. The trial was brief, and it was not Aren who presided. He handed the judgment over to the Circle of 5 in full view of everyone, and the Circle ruled unanimously. The 3 were sent into exile to the west with 3 days' worth of water, because an execution on the eve of the common cause would have split the camp through fear, whereas exile bound it together through contempt. Tarek and Ashera spent 4 days repairing the bed of the third channel with stones and roots, restoring it to the exact size of a palm. And on the 15th day, Yuna fell silent. She was standing among her birds on the marked-out area when she suddenly sat down on the ground, and the birds all took flight at once, forming a black cloud. She said that the voices from below had awakened before the bodies. The sleeper saw them, not with his eyes. He saw them through his sleep, just as a person dozing feels someone walking in the room, and his dreams turned evil. From that day on, the people began to have dreams as well. Throughout all the camps, people woke up screaming and told the same story: heat, darkness, the feeling of lying at the bottom with eyes watching you. Work ground to a halt. Hands were shaking. On the 17th day, at the second bridge, the work crew refused to go down into the riverbed, so Aren went there himself, silently picked up a pickaxe, and was the first to descend, working in the riverbed for the entire shift. And word of this spread through the canals faster than Yuna's birds. The shifts returned to the riverbeds. On the 18th day, everything was ready. 11 kilometers of canals, 9 crossings with wedge charges, and Tarek's sledgehammer-driven blasting holes. Aren had 3 copies of the time calculation. According to the map, the awakening was to begin on the 60th day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with a large breach beneath the junction, and the water was supposed to flow the moment the junction opened, falling down within the first minutes before the sleeper rose. A delay of even an hour would turn the blow blow into a bite. The camps were moved away from the fault to the cliff at the descent and to the distant ridges. Irma, with 50 men, stood at the first-line crossings. Corvus, with his swarm, was at the second. Tarek was at the third. Mirrors served as signals by day and 3 bonfires by night. And Yuna's birds duplicated everything with a living chain. On the evening of the 19th day, that is, on the eve of the deadline, Aaron gathered the Circle of Five one last time before the strike and told them what he was obliged to say. He said that, for the first time, his map did not give an accuracy figure for the following day. Every day of his gift had been 99% accurate. Tomorrow was a blank. He said he didn't know what that meant, and that perhaps it meant tomorrow was not predetermined, and its lines were being written right now by their own hands. Galen smiled heavily and said that for 40 years he had dreamed of hearing exactly that from fate. The night before the 60th day, no one slept. Aaron sat on the cliff at the foot of the descent and looked east, where the 1,000 lakes lay beneath the stars. In the morning, this water would die as lakes and might save them all as a weapon. Irma sat nearby, sharpening a knife, not because she needed it, but because her hands craved something to do. She asked if Aaron remembered the day of the Funpei, Hill 47, and the crowd's laughter. Aaron replied that he remembered every face. Irma said that was how a worthless talent ended. The man with the rain forecast sits on a rock, and tomorrow, by his word, 5 peoples will pour the sea down the god's throat. She said this without a smile, and coming from a northern woman, it was the highest honor she knew. Before dawn, the earth sighed deeply and lingeringly, and in the south, in the darkness, another wall crashed down into the rift with a roar. Aaron opened the map for the last time. The knot was burning. His trembling broke completely from its rhythm, and in the void where the precision number should have been, for a second it seemed to him that the void was staring back at him. He extinguished the map and went to wake the camps. The 60th day was beginning. In 19 days, the 5 bastions had cut through 11 kilometers of canals, with 9 planned crossings. Meanwhile, Corvus's swarm had carved through the stone, Ashira's roots had held the scree in place, and Yuna's crows had found a hidden cavity. Delmar's network had uncovered the sabotage carried out by the sect of believers in the Sleeper. The guilty parties were by the court of the 5th Circle, and when the Sleeper's shift refused to descend due to evil dreams, Aaron brought the people back, working in the channel first. Everything was ready for the water's impact in the first minutes of awakening, but for the first time, Aaron's map did not provide an exact figure for the 60th day, leaving a void, and before dawn, the earth began to fall out of rhythm. The 60th day began with a silence so complete that the 4,000 people on the cliffs could hear their own blood. And Aaron knew from the map that this silence would last until the 4th hour after noon. Beyond that, the map knew nothing. The morning dragged on like cooling resin. The people had been standing at their posts since dawn. Irma was at the first line of the bridges. Corvus, with his silver cloud, was at the second. Tarek was at the third, with his sledgehammer teams. On the cliff at the junction, next to Aaron, stood Galen, Ashira, Delmar, and Yuna with their birds, and the mirror bearers held their signal shields at the ready. By noon, the birds fell silent. All at once, across the entire sky, Yuna said, her lips white, that the voices from below had stopped dreaming. At the 4th hour after noon, the earth followed its schedule for the last time. The knot burst. It was unlike the tremors before. The plain east of the rift rose like a hump, climbed to the height of a wall, and then collapsed, and cracks ran across it in all directions like ice under impact, and the main crack of the rift roared as it widened, with fields breaking away from its edges. Aaron thrust out his hand, and the mirror makers flashed a light. The flash was repeated along the chain, and across 11 kilometers of canals, all 9 bridges collapsed in a single minute. Corvus's swarm cut through theirs cleanly. Tarek's sledgehammers shattered the chutes. Irma's wedges worked as planned, and the Thousand Lakes died and was reborn as a spear. The water surged forward. At first it was a sound like a distant wind, then a rumble. Then the entire eastern horizon rose and fell, and the 3 man-made channels merged into a single wave. A wave as high as a mountain, made of cold lake water, which, gathering speed from a 40-meter drop, surged into the opened knot of the rift. It plunged downward into the darkness for a quarter of an hour as a solid wall, and the earth responded from the depths with steam that rose a kilometer above the fault. And in that steam, the day turned white. And then a response came from below. The sound that rose from the depths was not the roar of a beast. It was a voice, low and meaningful, and there was so much fury and so much antiquity in it that the people on the cliffs fell to their knees, covering their ears, not because of the volume, but because of the meaning. The sleeper awoke in the icy water that gushed into his heat, and the water boiled around him as he rose through it. The edge of the fault, 2 kilometers from the cliff where the path descended, swelled and split open, and from the chasm, amid clouds of steam, appeared what Aaron would see for the rest of his life in his heavy dreams: a ridge. A black stone ridge, a kilometer long, like the spine of an emerging island, and fire raced along the ridge through the cracks like blood in veins. The ridge rose 100 paces, and the water roared around it in whirlpools and crashed against it, yet it rose higher still. The plan worked, and the plan failed. There was a sea of water, and yet there wasn't enough. The sleeper was greater than any calculation. And then something happened that wasn't in a single forecast sheet. Galen was the first to realize it. He stood at the edge of the cliff, listening to the earth with his whole body, and turned to Aaron, shouting through the roar that the water had settled into the den, but wasn't trapped there. It was flowing further down through the lower fissures, and the heat was pushing it back up as a steam jet. They had to seal off the exit. Bring down the vaults above the den so the water would remain inside, like in a sealed cauldron, and the cooling rock would crush the awakened creature on its own. Aaron snatched Tarek's survey sheets. The vaults of the den were supported by a pillar, but they had all these days simply assumed was a rock. On the round rock at the foot of the slope, the very one on which 4,000 people had stood. It served as a stone plug over the den's vault, and if its base were undercut from the eastern side, it would slide down entirely and seal the cauldron. Tarek glanced at the sheets and then at Aaron's face, and said that it was possible to chip away at the base, and that Corvus's swarm could cut through it in an hour, but that the rock wouldn't fall instantly, it would slide down, and that people had to be evacuated from it immediately, and that the last team of carvers wouldn't have time to get out. After that, everything happened very quickly. Delmar and Ashera herded thousands of people off the cliff toward the western ridges in living rivers. Yuna summoned all the birds, and the birds led the columns in pairs like pilots. Corvus listened to the task for exactly 10 seconds. Then he said that the swarm could cut through stone with palm-width precision, but the swarm had to be controlled from within the cut until the very last second, and that this was a job for one person, and that person was standing right in front of them. He said that he'd kept people in fear his whole life, and wanted to try the opposite just once. He smiled slightly at the corner of his mouth, and added that he'd survived twice thanks to someone else's precision, and that the West pays its debts. Galen stood beside him. He said that the swarm would cut the stone, but only the one who could hear the earth from from within, could tell at exactly which second the vault would give way, and that his lakes were already down there, and he wanted to guide them to the end. He looked at Aaron and asked for one thing, that the voice of the continent lead the people away and not look back. Aaron stood before the two rulers who had written themselves out of the future for the sake of the common cause, and he understood that he had no right to argue because any other outcome would kill everyone. He took the sheet with the final forecast from his belt, handed it to Galen, and said that on the back was written the time when the mist would clear and the sky would become visible, and that he wanted them down below to have a schedule until the very end. Galen took the sheet as one would accept a reward. They had been leaving the cliff for 2 hours. Aaron was the last to depart, and 2 remained on the eastern edge, shrouded in white mist. The silver cloud was already gnawing at the base, and the ringing was so loud that it could be heard through the voice from the depths. From the western ridge, 4,000 people watched as the crest in the rift rose another 50 paces, and as a black, jagged fissure grew toward it at the base of the descent cliff. Then Galen, down below, raised his hand. Corvus led the swarm to the very last palm-sized stone. The rock face sighed, swayed, and slid down whole, like a cork into the neck of a bottle. It fell for a long time. It entered the vault of the lair, and the vault burst and caved in for kilometers all around, and the entire knot of the fault collapsed in on itself, and the water, having nowhere left to flow, closed in over the ridge. A voice from the depths rose to a scream, and the scream turned into a cackle, then into a gurgle, then into a rumble, and the rumble went deeper and deeper, as if someone were sinking through the layers of the world. Then there was silence, in which one could hear the steam settling. The earth stood still. The people on the ridges did not move until sunset. At sunset, the steam settled, and a new face of the valley was revealed. The fault was no more. There was a circular basin 10 kilometers in diameter, and the remnants of the lake water were still flowing into the basin from the east, through 3 man-made channels. At the bottom of the basin, a young sea already stood, steaming warmly. The sleeper lay beneath this sea, beneath the vault, beneath the rock. And if he was alive, then between him and the sky now lay water and stone and water. Una sat down on the ground, closed her eyes, and listened for a long time. Then she said that the voices below could hear only a deep, cold rumble, like a breath, very slow, a dream without dreams. Aaron stood above the basin of the new sea, holding in his hands the 2 objects that the other 2 had given him before his descent. The seal of the Lake Bastion from Galen, and the steel plate from Corvus's rook, which, without its master, had become mere warm metal and was cooling in his palm like something alive. He opened the map. The map was blank. 60 days lay ahead of him, smooth and peaceful, and in the right-hand corner stood once again the accuracy number 99. And Aaron stared at that number longer than at anything else. The emptiness was gone. The future had once again agreed to be predictable. That same night, the system spoke for the last time that year. The voice was shorter than usual. It reported that the purification cycle had been interrupted by the intervention of the survivors, that this was the first time such a thing had happened in the entire history of the Sowings, and that the continent of Saret was transitioning from test mode to inheritance mode. The voice said that what lay ahead belonged to the living, and it fell silent as one falls silent forever. A year after the day the rock vanished into the throat of the Aran Fault, Aaron stood on the shore of a new sea and watched the first boats sail across the water. And that year held more life than all of his previous life before the transfer. That year condensed into images that he reviewed as he stood on the shore. The first image was of grief and bread. After the victory, the continent buried the dead and sowed seeds at the same time. On the western ridge above the sea's basin, 2 stones were set. Galen's stone gazed at the water that had once been his lakes. Corvus's stone gazed toward the sunset in the direction of his west. Below, on the shared wall, All the names from the first day of the relocation had been carved, and at the top of the list for Dry Mountain stood the name Kala. The second image was of an alliance. A month after the day of the bowl, the surviving rulers gathered at Dry Mountain, and Aaron did what no one expected of him the least. Absolute power was handed to him on a silver platter. Ashera said that the continent needed a single voice forever. The people of the orphaned Lake and Western Bastions begged to come directly under his rule. Aaron refused. He said that a man who sees the future and holds all the power would, in 10 years, be a greater disaster than any sleeper, because no one would point out his mistakes to him. Instead of a throne, he placed a 5-page charter on the table. A continental council of 5 lands: Dry Mountain, the south of Ashera, Yuna's Nest, and the 2 orphaned lands, which the council had helped choose their own leaders from among their own people. The lake lands were led by Mara, whose calm eyes Aaron had remembered from his first diplomatic mission. After much debate, the West chose an old master stonemason, whom Corvus's swarm had obeyed more faithfully than humans during its master's lifetime. Common laws, a common road, a common grain reserve for a lean year, and a single common service, which they called the Weather Service, through which Aaron's forecasts were distributed to all the lands every week free of charge, because Aaron remembered the price of silence before the first flood for the rest of his days. The third scene was the people of his mountain. Holt became the continent's treasurer and was happy in the way a man is happy when his numbers finally align with the world. Orvin disbanded half the army to serve as road guards, and grumbled that he missed real trouble, and lied. Tarek cut a tunnel through the mountain to the southern floodplain and named it after Kale. Sila led caravans south. Irma went north with 50 people, brought the cornerstone back to life, and that very first winter took in 300 settlers there. She wrote short, 3-sentence letters to the mountain, where pride shone between the lines. Brant married the very woman whose child he had rocked to sleep on that peak during the long night, and his firstborn was named after his maternal grandfather. And Brant now walked the mountain with the face of a man who had finally understood why he had skin of stone. Delmar remained a negotiator on the council, and one evening he told Aaron that, for the first time in his life, he was trading in goods he wasn't ashamed to show in the light. Yuna had grown a head taller in a year, and her birds carried mail across the entire continent. When she came to the mountain, children followed her in a flock like her crows. The fourth painting was quiet, and Aaron never showed it to anyone. Every week, he would climb the old tower, unfold the map, raise his gaze to the bowl of the sea, and listen. From beneath the water and the rock came a steady, icy hum, as slow as the breath of one who sleeps without dreams. Over the course of a year, the rumble hadn't changed a single time. The Weather Service had received from Aaron a sealed chest containing the complete calculations for the basin, and an inscription reading, "Open if the rumble changes." And the chest stood in the archives like a loaded crossbow. Aaron hoped it would not be opened in his lifetime or in the lifetime of his grandchildren. And today, on the shore of the new sea, there was a celebration. It had been a year since the day of the bowl. The first fishing boats, built from timber that had grown from the ashes of the Western fire, were being launched onto the water, and Mara said with a laugh that the lake people were back by the water, and that this water was growing saltier with each passing month, and fish had already begun to appear in it, having come through underground veins, and no one knew from where. People from the 5 lands stood mixed together on the shore, and Aaron looked at them and found faces in the crowd that he remembered from before. There stands the man who laughed at Plot 47 on the day of the land distribution, and now his daughter is married on Dry Mountain. There is the old man whom Delmar's troops pulled out of the mud beneath a landslide. There was a northern woman from Cornerstone, rocking a child born during the long night in the fourth hall. Holt, standing nearby on the shore, calculated aloud that over the course of a year, the continent's population had grown from 4,200 to 5,000, and that births had outnumbered deaths for the first time since the relocation. He said he would be happy to keep tallying such figures until he grew old. In the evening after the celebration, Aron climbed alone to the summit of Dry Mountain, to the spot where he had once driven in the first stake. The mountain beneath him glowed with lights. In the valley, the floodplain and the road to the south shone, and far to the east, the new sea glistened in the moonlight. He sat down on a warm rock and unfolded the map to its full width. 150 kilometers of the world lay before him, along with 60 days of the future, and the future was simple. Rain on schedule, early snow in the north by the end of the second month, and a letter had already been sent to Irma. A good run of fish in the new sea in 3 weeks. No disasters, no migrations, no emptiness. The number 99 stood in the corner, steady and calm. Aron looked at this peaceful future and thought about what he had never spoken aloud. His talent had come to him by chance, a blind draw in the trap on the gray plain. That same lot could have fallen into the hands of Corvus, or the sect, or any of those who, armed with that vision, would have gone not to gather people, but to collect tribute. He was not the chosen one. He was a man to whom precision had fallen, and who chose what to do with it each time. To remain silent before the flood, to warn before the fire, to open the gates to enemies, to give his hour to the two by the cliff. The vision showed the weather. His choices made him human. He recalled the system's words about the mode of inheritance, and now understood them in his own way. Inheritance is not a gift from above. It is when those who follow receive a world that does not need to be won anew. Down below in the square by the gates, children from the 5 lands were burning a festive bonfire, fearing neither water nor darkness nor fangs, and that was the inheritance. Aron turned off his map and sat for a long time, simply gazing at the flames. The man who could see the weather a month in advance and built a shelter where everyone else saw only a worthless rock had watched his story play out to the end, and it did not end with a throne or a battle. It ended with a calm sky above 5,000 sleeping people, an even number in the corner of the map, and a rumble beneath the new sea, slow as a breath. He came down from the summit after midnight. At the foot of the tower, Irma was waiting for him. She had come from the north for the holiday and hadn't told him about it so she could see the look on his face. They stood in silence, the kind of silence that people who have weathered every storm and every trial together know how to share. Then she asked what the map showed. Aron replied that the map showed good weather, long-lasting good weather, and for the first time in 2 years, those words meant exactly what they meant.